Okay, let's go. Number 1. Fugu liver and ovaries. You are at a fisherman's table on the coast of pre-modern Japan, a small, mottled fish laid open on the cutting board in front of you. Everyone gathered at this table tonight knows the rule. The liver goes in the fire, not on the plate. Tonight, an old man reaches for it anyway, daring the rest of the table to say something. He eats it before anyone can stop him. Within the hour, his lips go numb, then his hands, then his legs. He is still awake, still able to hear everyone around him panicking, as his own body stops answering to him one muscle at a time. There is no cure sitting in this house, or in any house in Japan, that can save him, and everyone at the table knows it, because this has happened before, in other villages, to other men who reached for the same forbidden bite. The fish is pufferfish, most dangerously the genus Takifugu, and the organ he ate is saturated with tetrodotoxin, one of the most potent natural poisons known to science. Concentrated most heavily in the liver, ovaries, and skin, tetrodotoxin blocks sodium channels in nerve cells, shutting down the body's ability to send signals to its own muscles, a mechanism entirely different from most food poisonings, and one the human body has no natural defense against. Victims typically remain fully conscious as paralysis climbs from the extremities toward the chest, aware of everything happening around them until the diaphragm fails and breathing stops, all without any pain-relieving effect from the toxin itself. There is no antidote, and even modern intensive care, with ventilators and round-the-clock monitoring, can only manage the paralysis while the toxin runs its course through the body over the following day or two. Deaths among samurai eating fugu became common enough that in 1592, the warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi banned his troops from eating it entirely, fearing it was killing more of his men during the Korean campaign than enemy combat was. The Edo period shogunate that followed periodically restricted or banned fugu consumption outright for the general population as well. The danger never stopped anyone. Fugu remained, and remains today, one of Japan's most prized and expensive delicacies, served in specialized restaurants that exist almost entirely around the ritual of eating it safely, prepared by chefs who must complete years of rigorous, government-mandated licensing and pass a strict practical exam before they are legally permitted to sell it, an exam with a failure rate historically reported near 60 to 70% even among trained culinary professionals, and liver from the fish remains banned for commercial sale nationwide even now, because no method of preparation has ever been found to make that specific organ reliably safe to eat. Toxicologists and culinary historians explain fugu's enduring popularity as a case of prestige and thrill outweighing documented, repeated risk, a pattern seen in extreme foods across many cultures where the danger itself becomes part of the appeal rather than a deterrent from it. The meat itself, properly separated from the liver, ovaries, and skin by a trained hand, is genuinely low in toxin and safe to eat, which allowed the dish to survive centuries of recorded deaths without ever being permanently banned. Japan's elaborate licensing system, requiring years of apprenticeship before a chef can legally touch the fish for customers, developed specifically because ordinary culinary training was never enough to guarantee survival. The specific danger of the liver, prized by some diners specifically for the mild, tingling numbness a sublethal trace of toxin produces on the lips and tongue, created a demand that persisted precisely because of the risk rather than despite it, a thrill-seeking motivation historians have compared to other extreme culinary or recreational risks across cultures, from raw meat traditions to high-alcohol drinking games, where the appeal and the danger are ultimately the same feature rather than two separate things. But this explanation does not fully account for why, given centuries of well-documented and often fatal outcomes, an entire national licensing infrastructure was built around a food that could simply be left unregulated by removing the dangerous organs from the supply chain entirely. Liver remains banned for sale, and yet black market and informal consumption of it persists in Japan even today, occasionally still resulting in hospitalization or death reported in the news each year. If tetrodotoxin exposure is this well understood, and this consistently fatal without treatment, the continued informal pursuit of the organ itself raises a harder question about how much of fugu's appeal was ever really about the meat at all. Some food historians and psychologists studying risk-seeking behavior propose that fugu's danger became inseparable from its cultural prestige, precisely because it could not be tamed, the way most dangerous foods eventually are. Unlike a poison neutralized through fermentation or careful timing, tetrodotoxin offered no process, no ritual, no mastery that could ever make the liver itself fully safe, only careful removal and avoidance, which may explain why some diners specifically sought out the version that still carried genuine risk. How many recorded deaths across Japanese history were quietly treated as the price of a delicacy rather than a solvable problem? Was the shogunate's repeated banning and unbanning of fugu driven by public safety concerns, or by concern over losing warriors and laborers to a food nobody was willing to give up? And if modern Japan, with full scientific understanding of tetrodotoxin, still cannot make the liver safe enough to legally sell, what does that say about how many other ancient dangers this list still holds that no amount of modern science has ever managed to solve? From a poison hidden inside specific organs of a beloved delicacy, we travel to the Caribbean, where an entire fruit, not just one part of it, has never had a single safe way to eat it. Number 2. Manganese fruit. You are walking a beach in the Caribbean, 16th century, sand still warm under bare feet. A tree leans low over the shoreline, heavy with small green fruit that look exactly like crab apples. Sweet-smelling, inviting. A local guide grabs your wrist before you can pick one. Too late for the man beside you, who already took a bite. Within minutes his mouth is on fire, his throat swelling shut, blisters rising across his lips. He will not survive the night. The tree behind you is not shade at all. It is a weapon that has been standing quietly here for centuries, and everyone on this coast, except you, already knew to stay away from it. This is the manchineel, widely regarded as the most dangerous plant on Earth. Hippomane manzanella grows across the Caribbean, Florida, and the coasts of Central America. Every part of it, bark, leaves, fruit, and sap alike, is toxic. The bark weeps a milky sap loaded with 4-ball esters and related compounds that blister skin on contact within minutes. Standing beneath the tree during rainfall is enough. Water running off the leaves carries the sap down onto anyone sheltering underneath, and the burns can be severe enough to require hospital treatment. Burning manchineel wood releases fumes that have caused temporary blindness in people simply standing nearby. And modern poison control centers across Florida and the Caribbean still log cases of severe contact, dermatitis every year from tourists who touched the bark or sap without knowing what they were looking at. The fruit itself, small and green and genuinely resembling an apple, is the most lethal part of all. Local names translate directly to warnings. Manzanilla de la Muerte, the little apple of death. Indigenous Taino and Carib peoples who lived alongside this tree for thousands of years did not treat it as a hazard to avoid. They weaponized it. Arrow tips were dipped in manchineel sap before battle, turning a simple wound into a slow, agonizing death. Spanish colonial accounts describe captives tied directly to the trunk of a manchineel tree as a method of execution, the tree itself doing the work no blade needed to. Some historians have connected this practice to the death of Juan Ponce de Leon, the Spanish conquistador wounded by an arrow during a 1521 expedition to Florida, an injury from which he never recovered. Today, manchineel trees across the Caribbean and Florida are marked with red paint or warning signs, a modern precaution against a danger nobody has ever fully tamed, and some municipal parks departments have gone as far as fencing off individual trees entirely rather than relying on signage alone. Guinness World Records lists it as the most dangerous tree on the planet, a title it has held without serious challenge since records of this kind began being kept. Botanists and toxicologists explain the manchineel as an extreme but logical outcome of evolutionary pressure. A slow-growing coastal tree with soft, easily damaged bark needed a defense potent enough to deter every possible threat, from insects to grazing animals to humans looking for shade or fruit. 4-ball esters are already known as powerful irritants in smaller doses elsewhere in the plant kingdom. The manchineel simply concentrated them to an extreme. The tree's proximity to popular beaches is not a mystery either. Manganese is naturally adapted to sandy, saline coastal soil where few other trees can survive, which is exactly the terrain humans have always been drawn to build resorts, docks, and villages upon. The indigenous use of its sap as arrow poison and execution method fits a broader pattern seen worldwide, cultures adapting whatever lethal resource their environment provided into tools of war and justice. But this explanation does not fully account for the sheer margin of danger involved. Most toxic plants require ingestion, direct contact with broken skin, or significant exposure before symptoms appear. Manganese can injure a person who has done nothing more than stand under it while it rains, or breathe smoke from a fire built with driftwood that happened to include its branches. Colonial-era sailors, unfamiliar with the tree, reportedly used its wood for shipbuilding and shelter before learning the hard way what they were working with. And the timing of the warning signs raises its own question. If the danger was well understood by Caribbean peoples for millennia before European contact, why did it take so long, and cost so many lives, for that knowledge to be formally documented and posted for outsiders? Ethnobotanists studying the plant's use among Caribbean peoples suggest that manchineel's dual role, as both poison and something closely monitored rather than eradicated, points to a sophisticated relationship with a dangerous resource rather than simple avoidance. Communities that lived beside these trees for generations appear to have developed precise, transmitted knowledge of exactly which parts were lethal on contact, which required processing, and which could be handled with care during arrow preparation. Knowledge specific enough to weaponize the tree deliberately, rather than merely survive its presence. How many people died before that knowledge became reliable enough to pass down? Was the execution method drawn from an even older tradition of testing the tree's danger on captives specifically to study its effects? And if a rainstorm alone can send a modern tourist to the hospital, how did anyone ever get close enough to harvest the sap for arrow poison in the first place? How many failed harvesting attempts, ending in blindness or severe burns, did it take before that technique became reliable enough to trust in battle? From a fruit lethal on contact, we travel to a poison ancient hunters ground down deliberately and smeared onto meat, a substance that could kill the animal it was meant for and the person preparing it just as easily. Number 3. Aconite poison meat. You are crouched at the edge of a mountain forest, ancient Greece, or the foothills of the Himalayas, grinding a handful of small, dark blue flowers and their roots into a thick paste. You handle the mixture with a wrapped cloth, never bare skin, because everyone who taught you this already lost someone to a careless cut. The paste goes onto strips of raw meat, left out for wolves that have been raiding the herd. By morning, every wolf that touched the bait is dead. So once was a careless apprentice who forgot to wash his hands before eating his own dinner that same night, numbness spreading up his fingers before he had even finished the meal. The plant is aconitum, commonly called wolfsbane or monkshood, and its very name across multiple ancient languages directly references its historic use as a wolf-killing poison. Aconitum napellus and Aconitum ferox contain Aconitum ferox, contain Aconitum ferox, contain Aconitum, one of the most potent toxins found in any plant on Earth, present in the roots, leaves, and flowers alike. Ancient Greek, Chinese, and Himalayan cultures independently developed the practice of coating hunting bait, arrow tips, and spear points with a crushed paste made from the aconite root to bring down wolves, large game, and enemy combatants alike. Aconitine works by locking sodium channels in nerve and heart tissue into a permanently open state, producing numbness, muscle weakness, dangerously irregular heartbeat, and in sufficient doses, cardiac arrest, sometimes triggered by absorption through unbroken but cut or abraded skin alone, without the poison ever being swallowed at all. Ancient Chinese medical texts, some dating back over 2,000 years, describe both its use as a weapon and, in radically smaller and specially processed doses, as a component of certain traditional remedies, a use that required extensive preparation, including hours of boiling to break down the most dangerous alkaloids, and remained strictly separate, in trained hands, from the raw, weaponized form ordinary hunters carried into the field. Even today, foragers across parts of Asia and the United Kingdom are poisoned nearly every year after mistaking aconite's roots for wild parsnip or horseradish, and its young leaves for edible mountain greens, deaths that continue to occur despite full modern awareness of the plant's danger, with poison control centers in the United Kingdom alone logging serious aconite exposures most years, often traced to home gardens where monkshood is still grown ornamentally, its striking blue-purple flowers prized by gardeners with little idea of what the roots beneath them are capable of. Toxicologists and historians of ancient hunting practices explain aconite's use as a straightforward application of the most effective tool, available in mountainous regions across Europe and Asia where wolves and large predators threaten livestock and human settlements alike. The plant grew abundantly and visibly in exactly the terrain where hunter-gatherer and pastoral societies needed it most, and its potency meant even small quantities, smeared thinly on bait or a blade's edge, were sufficient to kill quickly and reliably, making it an efficient, low-cost solution long before any alternative method of large predator control existed. Handling protocols, wrapped cloths, careful washing, avoiding any contact with open cuts appear to have been common knowledge passed down specifically because the plant's danger to the handler was as well understood as its danger to the intended target. Chinese and Himalayan traditions that developed heavily processed medicinal uses alongside the weaponized raw form demonstrate a sophisticated, generations-deep understanding of dosage and preparation that separated a controlled therapeutic application from an uncontrolled lethal one. But this explanation does not fully account for how many people were lost discovering exactly where that line sat. Aconitine's lethal dose is measured in a few milligrams, an amount easily exceeded by simple miscalculation, and the plant shows no reliable taste or smell warning strong enough to prevent accidental ingestion, evidenced by how consistently modern foragers with full scientific knowledge of the danger continue to poison themselves through simple misidentification. If ancient hunters were regularly grinding this root by hand with only cloth as protection, the margin for a fatal mistake during ordinary daily use would have been narrow and constant, not an occasional risk, but a near certainty across enough repetitions. Some historians of ancient medicine and warfare, examining how frequently the plant appears across unrelated hunting and military traditions, propose that aconite poisoning may have been so routine among hunters, herbalists, and warriors handling the plant regularly that individual deaths were simply absorbed as an accepted cost of the trade, rarely significant enough on their own to be separately recorded by chroniclers who were far more interested in battles and kings. How many hunters across these cultures died from their own poison rather than an animal's attack, deaths quietly folded into a broader, unremarkable mortality that ancient record-keepers had no particular reason to distinguish? Did the plants use as both weapon and, in far smaller processed doses, medicine ever blur dangerously in practice, with a slightly miscalculated remedy killing the very patient it was meant to treat? And if modern foragers, with laboratories and warning labels available to them, are still poisoned by this plant today, how much confidence should anyone really have in how carefully any ancient handler managed a substance this unforgiving? From a poison smeared deliberately onto meat to trap animals, we travel to Rome, where a nearly identical danger was brewed directly into an empire's own dinner and drink, not by accident, but on purpose, for centuries. Number 4. Lead-sweetened wine. You are a guest at a Roman senator's villa, 2nd century AD, reclining at a table heavy with roasted meat and fruit preserved in dark, syrupy sweetness. A slave pours wine and stirs in a spoonful of that same syrup, thick as honey, deep amber in color. It softens the wine's bite and leaves a pleasant, sweet finish nothing else can match. Your host swears by it. So does every wealthy household in Rome. None of them know that the pot it was cooked in, and the reaction that made it so irresistibly sweet, is quietly poisoning every person at this table, 1 cup at a time, for years. The syrup is called sapa, or defrutum, when boiled down less, made by simmering grape, must slowly over an open fire for hours until it reduces down to a thick, sweet concentrate. Roman cooks strongly preferred to make it in lead pots rather than bronze or copper, because lead produced a noticeably sweeter, more stable result. What was actually happening, unknown to anyone at the time, was a chemical reaction between the acidic grape must and the lead vessel that produced lead acetate, historically nicknamed sugar of lead for its intensely sweet taste. Sapa was used constantly across Roman households of every social rank to sweeten wine, preserve fruit, and as a folk remedy for ailments ranging from coughs to upset stomachs. Roman writers, including agricultural authors of the era, specifically recommended lead vessels over other metals for making it. Chronic lead exposure produces a well-documented range of symptoms: gout, infertility, cognitive decline, mood instability, and in severe cases, seizures and psychosis. Roman writers of the period frequently described gout as a disease specifically associated with the wealthy, a detail modern toxicologists now read as an unintentional record of exactly who was consuming the most sapa and drinking from the most lead-glazed vessels. In 1983, toxicologist Jerome Enriagu published research proposing that widespread lead exposure through wine, cookware, and even water pipes, from which Rome's own word for plumbing derives, may have measurably contributed to declining health fertility, and mental stability among the Roman elite in the empire's final centuries. Historians of Roman society explain that Sapa's popularity followed straightforward culinary logic. Wine was often harsh and heavily acidic, and any additive that improved its taste while also acting as a preservative offered clear practical value. Lead was cheap, widely available, and easy to work into cookware, making lead pots the accessible standard rather than a luxury indulgence. Modern isotope analysis of skeletal remains from the Roman period has confirmed measurably elevated lead levels compared to pre-Roman populations in the same regions, particularly among wealthier individuals who could afford wine, sapa, and lead-glazed tableware in greater quantities than the general population. Some of these studies have found lead concentrations in Roman-era bone samples measured at levels many times higher than in pre-Roman remains from the same burial grounds, a gap researchers consider difficult to explain by anything other than sustained dietary exposure across a lifetime. Some researchers frame lead exposure as one contributing factor among many, alongside political instability, economic strain, and military overextension, rather than a singular cause of imperial decline, a more measured position than Enriagu's original framing suggested, though most agree the exposure was real, widespread, and almost certainly underappreciated by the Romans experiencing it firsthand. But this explanation struggles with one detail that should have prevented the problem entirely. Roman physicians were not ignorant of lead's dangers. The Greek physician Dioscorides, writing in the 1st century AD, explicitly warned that lead caused the mind to become disordered. Vitruvius, the Roman architect and engineer, cautioned against lead water pipes for similar reasons in his own writings. If educated Romans, including the very people prescribing sapa as medicine, already suspected lead caused harm, why did the elite continue manufacturing and consuming it deliberately for centuries afterward, rather than switching to bronze or ceramic? And if elevated lead exposure really did impair cognition and fertility among the wealthiest, most powerful families in the empire, how much of Rome's reputation for erratic, paranoid, and short-lived leadership in its final centuries was shaped by politics and ambition alone, and how much was quietly chemistry? Some historians of medicine argue the warnings that survive in ancient texts may represent a minority scientific opinion overridden by taste, cost, and generations of unquestioned tradition. Not unlike modern society's knowingly continuing habits understood to be unhealthy, because changing them is inconvenient or expensive. Others suggest sapa's reputation as a status marker, a sweetness only the wealthy could consistently afford year-round, may have made the danger self-selecting, concentrating exposure most heavily among exactly the ruling class, whose stability the empire depended on. Was Dioscorides' warning widely known and simply ignored, or was it a fringe view most Roman households never encountered? Did the wealthiest, most politically powerful Romans suffer the worst exposure precisely because status demanded it? Could an empire's entire ruling class have been gradually impairing its own judgment for generations without a single person in power ever connecting the symptoms to the syrup on their own tables? And how many decisions attributed to cruelty, madness, or incompetence in the historical record of Rome's decline were, in some documented cases, the visible symptoms of a poison the empire's own elite manufactured for their dinner tables and refused to give up? From a poison an empire's elite manufactured on purpose for centuries, we travel to a besieged Gallic hill fort, where one tribal leader chose a different poison for himself, deliberately, in a single final act. Number 5. Eusedes. You are inside a besieged hill fort in Gaul, 54 BC, Roman legions closing in on every side. Catuvalcus, chief of the Eburones, is old, too old for the escape and endless hardship of war that the rest of his people now face. He will not be taken alive, and he will not run. He reaches instead for a handful of small seeds, plucked from a tree that grows just beyond the fort's walls, the same tree his people have always known to avoid. He eats them anyway, on purpose, and by the time Roman soldiers breach the gate, he is already gone. And there is nothing left for them to capture but a body and an empty hand still loosely closed around a few crushed red seeds. This account comes directly from Julius Caesar's own Commentarii de Bello Gallico, his first-hand record of the Gallic Wars, which describes Catuvalcus taking his own life with yew poison rather than endure further war or the hardship of fleeing at his advanced age. The tree is Taxus baccata, the European yew, and nearly every part of it, bark, needles, and seeds, contains taxine alkaloids capable of stopping the human heart within hours of ingestion. There has never been an antidote. Modern medicine offers only supportive treatment, managing symptoms while the body either survives the cardiac disruption or does not. And even with intensive cardiac monitoring available today, severe taxine poisoning still carries a real risk of sudden, fatal arrhythmia with little warning. Strangely, the yew is not uniformly deadly. The soft, bright red, barrel-like structure surrounding each seed, called an aril, is the one part of the entire tree that is not toxic, sweet enough that birds eat it whole and pass the hard seed inside undigested and unharmed, spreading the tree exactly as it evolved to do. The seed itself, if bitten, crushed or chewed rather than swallowed whole, releases the taxine alkaloids directly and remains just as capable of killing a person today as it was for Catavolcus in 54 BC. Modern poisoning cases, including fatalities among horses, cattle, and other livestock that graze on discarded hedge clippings, and occasional human deaths from ingestion, whether accidental or deliberate, are still documented today, sometimes within hours of exposure, and with little the treating hospital can do beyond supportive cardiac care. Botanists and toxicologists explain the yew's split nature as a textbook example of a plant engineering its own seed dispersal around a built-in defense, a strategy that has kept the species thriving across Europe and parts of Asia for millions of years longer than most trees native to the same forests. The toxic seed coat protects the tree's genetic material from being destroyed by digestion, while the surrounding sweet, harmless flesh rewards the animal carrying it away, a strategy shared with many fruiting plants but rarely with a threat this severe attached to the seed itself. Ancient Gallic and Celtic peoples living alongside yew trees for generations would have had ample opportunity to observe its effects on livestock or through accidental exposure, likely making its use as a deliberate poison, whether for hunting, warfare, or as Caesar records, personal choice in extremis, a matter of long-transmitted practical knowledge rather than a sudden discovery. But this explanation does not fully account for how precisely Catavolcus, or whoever guided him to that choice, understood the correct quantity and preparation needed to guarantee a fatal outcome rather than a prolonged, survivable illness. Taxine alkaloid concentration varies meaningfully between the needles, bark, and seeds, and between individual trees and seasons, meaning a miscalculated dose could plausibly have resulted in severe illness without death, an outcome far worse than either survival or a clean end for someone deliberately choosing to die on his own terms rather than face capture, leaving a badly poisoned but still living man in agony for hours with no way to reverse course. Caesar's account offers no detail on how that certainty was achieved, only that it worked. Some historians of ancient Gaul, reading Caesar's account alongside broader archaeological and botanical evidence from the region, argue that yew poisoning may have functioned as a known, culturally understood method available specifically to leaders and warriors facing capture. A deliberate alternative to a battlefield death or Roman enslavement that required no weapon, no accomplice, and no assistance, only private access to a tree that grew commonly across the region and the knowledge of exactly which part of it to use. If that is accurate, it raises the question of how many similarly recorded or unrecorded deaths among Gallic and Celtic leaders during Rome's campaigns followed the same quiet method, visible to history only when a chronicler like Caesar happened to think it was worth mentioning. How widely known was the correct method and dose among Gallic society, and was it common knowledge or a closely guarded piece of leadership lore? Why does the tree's own biology place its most lethal part directly beside its only harmless one? A design that makes fatal misidentification, whether accidental or deliberate, disturbingly easy. And how many quieter deaths, animal and human alike, has this same tree caused in the 2,000 years since Catavolcus, never significant enough to be recorded by anyone at all? From a poison a leader chose for himself in a single deliberate act, we travel to a hedgerow where a small, sweet, ordinary-looking berry has fooled foragers into a fatal mistake for centuries. Let me say one thing, and I won't bring it up again. All 50 places like this one are now one book, The Sealed Vault. Yours to keep, easy to gift, and the best way to support this channel. Links below. Let's get back to the video. Number 6. Deadly nightshade berries. You are a child in ancient Rome, or Renaissance Italy centuries later, wandering past a hedgerow where small, glossy black berries hang heavy on a bushy green plant. They look exactly like the other wild berries you have eaten all summer. This one is sweeter, almost pleasant, nothing like the bitter warning taste you might expect from something dangerous. By the time your mouth goes dry, your pupils widen, and your heart starts racing, you have already eaten more than one. Nobody warned you this berry was different from all the others, because from the outside there was no way to tell, the same glossy black skin and firm little stem as everything else you had safely eaten that summer. The plant is a tropobelladonna, deadly nightshade, containing tropane alkaloids, primarily atropine and scopolamine, throughout its leaves, roots, and especially its berries. In ancient and Renaissance Italy, women used diluted extracts of the plant as a cosmetic, applying drops directly to the eyes to dilate the pupils into the large, dark-eyed look then considered fashionable across Italian court society, a practice directly reflected in the plant species name, belladonna, meaning beautiful woman. The same plant, used undiluted, served a far darker historical purpose. Ancient historical accounts describe belladonna, along with other poisonous plants, as an instrument of political assassination in ancient Rome, extracts slipped into wine or food to eliminate rivals discreetly, a method prized specifically because the resulting illness looked like an ordinary, unremarkable death. Its lethality is beyond question. Symptoms of poisoning include a dry mouth, dilated pupils, flushed and reddened skin, a rapid pounding heart, vivid hallucinations, seizures, and death, and because children are smaller and more sensitive to the toxin, as few as 2 to 5 berries can be fatal for a child, while an adult may require a somewhat larger quantity to reach a lethal dose. Modern poison control centers, despite full public awareness of the plant's danger, still log cases of children eating the berries from unfenced gardens, parks, and hedgerows every year, with emergency treatment typically limited to supportive care and, in severe cases, medication to counteract the specific cardiac and neurological effects. Botanists and toxicologists explain the plant's dual reputation, cosmetic beauty aid and lethal poison, as simply 2 different doses and delivery methods of the exact same chemistry, a distinction modern pharmacology now understands precisely, but that ancient and Renaissance users could only have arrived at through generations of careful, costly trial and error. Diluted, carefully measured drops applied only to the eye produced a temporary, largely localized effect on the pupil with comparatively limited systemic absorption, a controlled cosmetic use that persisted for centuries despite the underlying danger of the plant it came from. Undiluted extract, or the whole berry itself, delivers a far larger, uncontrolled dose directly into the bloodstream through digestion, explaining the dramatic difference in outcome between a fashionable pupil and a fatal poisoning. The berry's sweetness, unusual for a plant this toxic, likely evolved for the same reason as many other fruiting plants, to encourage birds to eat it and disperse the seeds, with birds apparently far more resistant to the alkaloids than mammals, a mismatch between evolutionary strategy and human vulnerability that nightshade shares with several other toxic ornamental plants still commonly grown for their berries or flowers today, from certain popular garden shrubs to houseplants sold with little more than a small printed caution label. But this explanation does not fully account for why a plant this dangerous, capable of killing a child with a small handful of fruit, was never systematically removed from gardens, hedgerows, and public spaces across the regions where it grows wild, despite centuries of documented deaths. Unlike many of the deadliest plants on this list, belladonna does not require any specialized knowledge, harvesting technique, or preparation to become lethal. It simply needs to be picked and eaten, which makes its continued casual presence in unmarked, unfenced locations difficult to reconcile with how seriously ancient and modern societies alike have understood its danger. Some historians of botany and public health argue that belladonna's persistence reflects a broader pattern seen throughout this list, that familiarity with a danger does not necessarily translate into its removal, particularly when a plant also serves ornamental, medicinal, or cosmetic purposes valuable enough to outweigh the perceived risk to any one individual. Modern atropine, still derived from this same plant family, remains a critical emergency medicine used to treat certain poisonings and heart conditions today, a continued medical use that may partly explain why the plant was never targeted for eradication, the way some other toxic species eventually were. How many quiet, unrecorded childhood deaths across history were ever actually attributed to this berry, rather than simply logged as sudden, unexplained illness? How many of antiquity's most convenient political deaths owed more to this single hedgerow plant than to any blade, blow, or battlefield ever recorded by the historians who wrote them down. And if a plant this lethal still grows unfenced in public parks and gardens today, what does it say that modern society has made almost exactly the same calculation ancient Rome once did, that the risk, however real, is simply not worth uprooting? From a single sweet berry, we travel to medieval Europe, where an entire continent's bread supply carried a threat invisible to the naked eye, one that would trigger epidemics mistaken for witchcraft, plague, and possession for centuries before anyone understood what was actually growing in the grain. Number 7. Ergot-contaminated rye. You are a baker in a small medieval village, kneading dough from this year's rye harvest, a wet, difficult season that left the grain looking rougher than usual, flecked here and there with small dark purple kernels. Nobody thinks much of it. Rye always looks a little uneven. Within weeks, neighbors who ate bread from that same harvest are twitching uncontrollably, crawling on the ground convinced insects cover their skin, seeing visions no one else can, while others develop a burning sensation in their hands and feet so severe it precedes the slow blackening and loss of their fingers and toes. The village priest, seeing no earthly explanation, calls it a curse sent down on the whole community at once. Nobody in that bakery has any way of knowing it came from the flour itself. The cause is Claviceps purpurea, a fungus that infects rye and related grains during damp, cool growing seasons, replacing individual kernels with dark, hardened structures called ergot sclerotia, the very flecks that stood out in that harvest. Ground into flour and baked into ordinary loaves without anyone realizing the danger, ergot delivers a potent cocktail of alkaloids straight into the daily bread of an entire village, chemical relatives of the compounds later used to synthesize LSD in the 20th century. Ergotism, poisoning caused by consuming contaminated grain, historically presented in two distinct forms. The convulsive form produced seizures, muscle spasms, and vivid hallucinations, symptoms sometimes linked by historians to outbreaks of mass hysteria and so-called dancing mania recorded across medieval Europe. The gangrenous form, known widely as St. Anthony's fire for the burning sensation it produced, restricted blood flow to the extremities so severely that it caused tissue death, blackening, and the eventual loss of fingers, toes, or entire limbs. Epidemics recurred across Europe for centuries, particularly in regions of France, Germany, and the Low Countries dependent on rye as a staple grain during cold, wet growing years, with some chronicled outbreaks reportedly affecting entire parishes within the same season, straining local capacity to care for the sick. Monastic hospitals run by the Order of St. Anthony became specifically known for treating sufferers, offering them wheat bread instead of rye in isolation from contaminated harvests, a treatment that worked without anyone understanding why, and monastic records from several affected regions describe entire wards of patients recovering within weeks simply by being removed from the contaminated local harvest, evidence in hindsight that the cure was always sitting in plain view, hidden in plain sight inside the very act of changing what was on the table. Historians and toxicologists explain ergotism as a recurring, predictable consequence of pre-modern agriculture's vulnerability to weather and crop monitoring limitations. Damp seasons favored fungal growth, grain inspection methods were rudimentary at best, and rye, more susceptible to ergot infection than wheat, remained a dietary staple across much of northern and central Europe, precisely because it tolerated poor soil and harsh climates better than other grains. In 1976, psychologist Linda Caporael published a widely discussed analysis tracing the strange convulsions, visions, and psychiatric symptoms reported among accusers during the 1692 Salem witch trials in colonial Lingle Kyles. In colonial Massachusetts, directly to ergot-contaminated rye grown in the unusually damp conditions documented that season. A more contemporary case, the 1951 mass poisoning in Pont-Saint-Esprit, France, in which hundreds of residents experienced hallucinations, convulsions, and several died, was attributed to ergot-contaminated bread, a modern outbreak of the exact same medieval pattern playing out in the 20th century. Both incidents point to the same underlying danger, an invisible contaminant in the grain supply capable of producing symptoms severe enough to be mistaken for mass madness by an entire town. But the ergotism explanation, however well documented in the clearest historical cases, struggles to account for the sheer scale and duration of the panic these outbreaks generated across medieval society. Communities repeatedly attributed the convulsive and gangrenous symptoms to demonic possession, witchcraft, or divine punishment, rather than tainted food, even in regions that experience the same pattern of outbreak, following wet harvests again and again over generations. If the correlation between damp growing seasons and subsequent illness was, in hindsight, consistent enough for modern researchers to trace centuries later, why did it take so long for anyone at the time to connect specific harvests to specific outbreaks, rather than defaulting to supernatural explanation each time? Some historians of science argue that the answer lies less in a failure of observation, and more in the absence of any framework that could have made the connection meaningful. A society with no concept of fungal contamination had no reason to inspect grain for dark kernels as anything other than a cosmetic flaw, and a burning, convulsive illness striking dozens of people in the same village within days of each other would have looked, to contemporary eyes, exactly like the divine or demonic explanations already available to them. How many documented cases of witchcraft, possession, and dancing plagues across medieval and early modern Europe may share this same unrecognized chemical root, and how many trials, confessions, and executions during that era were ultimately decided by a courtroom's inability to imagine a fungus as the true culprit? Was the Order of St. Anthony's treatment method, isolating patients and feeding them wheat instead of rye, arrived at through genuine observation, or coincidence dressed up as religious care? And if the exact same fungus was still poisoning entire towns as recently as 1951, in an era of modern medicine and laboratories, how many outbreaks recorded 800 years earlier by observers with no scientific vocabulary at all went entirely unrecognized for what they truly were? From an accidental poison that spread panic across an entire continent, one bad harvest at a time. We traveled to a prison cell in ancient Athens for one final poisoning that was neither an accident nor a mystery, but a precisely measured dose administered on purpose by the state itself. Number 8. Hemlock. You are in a prison cell in Athens, 399 BC, sunset light coming through a small barred window. An old philosopher sits calmly among his weeping students, having spent the day discussing the nature of the soul as though this were any other afternoon. A guard enters with a cup of pale, unremarkable liquid. The philosopher takes it without hesitation, asks whether he may pour a small libation first, is told there is only enough for the dose itself, and drinks it down like a man finishing a cup of wine. Within the hour, Socrates will be dead, executed by his own city, using a plant that grows wild in fields most Athenians walked past without a second thought, one of the most famous deaths in Western history caused by one of the most ordinary-looking weeds in Greece. The plant is Conium maculatum, poison hemlock, and its primary toxic compound, the alkaloid coniine, produces a slow, ascending paralysis that climbs steadily upward from the feet while consciousness remains largely intact right up until the very end, when paralysis finally reaches the muscles controlling breathing. Plato's Phaedo, his account of Socrates' final hours, describes the philosopher's execution in precise, almost clinical detail, including his executioner instructing him to walk around after drinking the poison to help it take effect more quickly, and the philosopher's own calm, methodical observation of the numbness climbing through his own legs as he narrated his sensations to the students gathered around him. Death by hemlock poisoning under these conditions typically followed within 30 minutes to 2 hours, depending on the dose and the individual. Hemlock's use as a state-sanctioned method of execution in ancient Athens, carried out by a designated public official responsible for preparing and administering the dose, was not unique to Socrates. It appears elsewhere in Greek historical and legal sources as a standard method for carrying out death sentences against condemned citizens, a practice apparently routine enough that Plato's detailed account of Socrates stands out mainly for the fame of the man drinking the cup, not the method itself, which by all indications was simply how Athens carried out its ordinary business of executing the condemned. The plant itself, however, causes far more than deliberate executions. Poison hemlock closely resembles wild carrot, parsley, and fennel, 3 common edible plants in the same botanical family, and modern foragers, despite full access to identification guides and scientific literature, are still poisoned, sometimes fatally, after misidentifying it. No antidote existed in the ancient world, and modern medicine still offers only supportive treatment, typically mechanical ventilation, to keep the patient breathing until the toxin clears the body on its own, rather than anything that reverses coniine's effect directly. Historians of ancient Athenian law explain hemlock selection as a method of state execution as a matter of practical availability and a degree of relative predictability compared to other Athenian punishments. The plant grew commonly throughout Attica, was inexpensive and simple to prepare into a drinkable dose, and produced a death understood, at least by the standards of the time, to be less violent and more dignified than execution, by other means available in the ancient world. Athenian legal tradition placed real value on allowing condemned citizens, particularly those of Socrates' stature, a measure of dignity, control, and calm in their final hours, and hemlock's slow paralytic progression, rather than an instant or visibly violent death, suited that cultural preference. Classical scholars note that Plato's account, written as both history and philosophy, rather than a clinical record, likely emphasizes Socrates' composure deliberately, but the underlying medical progression it describes, ascending paralysis with retained awareness, aligns closely with what modern toxicology understands about Kanyan poisoning. But this explanation does not fully account for how consistently Athenian executioners were able to calibrate a fatal dose precisely enough to use hemlock as routine, repeatable state punishment, when the exact kanyan content of any given plant sample varies with growing conditions, plant maturity, and preparation method. Getting the amount wrong in either direction risked either a prolonged, incomplete poisoning or a death that failed to occur at all, either outcome a significant institutional embarrassment for a legal system relying on the method as standard practice. Achieving consistent, reliable results across what was apparently a routine, unremarkable procedure suggests a depth of practical, empirical pharmacological knowledge that ancient Athens is rarely credited with in other contexts. Some historians of ancient medicine argue that the specific knowledge required, likely held by whichever officials or specialists were responsible for preparing execution doses, may represent one of the more overlooked bodies of practical toxicological expertise in the ancient world, precise enough to be trusted by the state itself, but never systematized or written down in a form that survived. How many ordinary Athenians, foraging for wild carrot or parsley in the same fields, died accidentally from the exact same plant used to execute their philosophers, deaths far too common and unremarkable to warrant the kind of detailed account Plato left behind for Socrates? Was the dose genuinely standardized, or did Athenian executions sometimes go visibly, agonizingly wrong in ways later writers simply chose not to record? And if a city sophisticated enough to produce Socrates himself still relied on a wild harvested plant for something as consequential as state execution, how much of the ancient world's most important business was quietly running on exactly this kind of empirical, unwritten expertise? From one measured, deliberate death, we traveled to an emperor's dinner table for the single most consequential accidental poisoning on this entire list. Number 9. Death cap mushroom. You are at an imperial banquet in Rome, 54 AD. Reclining near the emperor himself as a favored dish is set before him, a plate of mushrooms, his favorite food, prepared exactly the way he likes them. His wife watches closely as he eats. Within hours, Claudius, ruler of the known world, master of an empire stretching from Britain to the edge of the Sahara, is violently ill. By the next day, he is dead, and his stepson Nero is emperor in his place. Nobody at that table can prove what happened. Nobody needs to. The suspicion alone is enough to change the succession of an empire before the body is even prepared for burial. Everyone already suspects, and 2,000 years later, modern toxicology confirms exactly what killed him. A mushroom so lethal that cooking, drying, or freezing it would have done absolutely nothing to save him. The mushroom is Amanita phalloides, the death cap, unassuming in appearance and easily confused with several edible species, and it remains responsible for the majority of fatal mushroom poisonings worldwide even today. Its toxins, a family of compounds called amatoxins, cause severe and often irreversible damage to the liver and kidneys, shutting down the body's ability to filter and process everything running through the bloodstream, typically after a delay of 6 to 12 hours during which the victim may feel entirely fine. A delay long enough that by the time symptoms begin, significant organ damage has frequently already occurred, and even with modern hospital care, including liver transplant in the most severe cases, fatality rates for untreated or late-treated amatoxin poisoning remain substantial. The Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius, writing decades after the events they describe, both record that Emperor Claudius died in 54 AD after eating a dish of mushrooms, and both name his fourth wife, Agrippina the Younger, along with the notorious professional poisoner Locusta, as the suspected architects of his death, allegedly using death cap extract to clear the path to the throne for Agrippina's son from a previous marriage, Nero. Mushroom poisoning as a tool of political assassination recurs throughout later European history as well, including a widely discussed case connecting the sudden 1534 death of Pope Clement VII to a dish of prized mushrooms, a pattern historians have noted repeats often enough across different courts and centuries to suggest the method was something of an open secret among those with the motive and the means to use it. Modern toxicology has confirmed what ancient poisoners may have understood only empirically, that amatoxins are remarkably stable, surviving cooking, boiling, drying, and freezing entirely intact, meaning the death cap is, chemically speaking, exactly as lethal today as it was in Claudius's dining room, whether it ends up in a Roman banquet dish or a modern forager's basket after being mistaken for an edible species. Historians of the Roman Empire explain Claudius's death as entirely consistent with a court, where political assassination by poison was a well-documented and frequently employed tool, and where Locusta in particular had an established, recorded history of preparing lethal doses for the imperial family, later used again, according to the same ancient sources, in the poisoning of Claudius's own son Britannicus under Nero's orders, a repute commission historians frequently cite as evidence of Locusta's established reputation and skill within the imperial court. Death cap mushrooms grow naturally across the same regions of Italy where Claudius would have obtained the mushroom dishes he was known to favor, meaning the poison required no exotic import, only correct identification and careful preparation, skills readily available to a trained poisoner like Locusta. Modern medical historians examining the ancient accounts alongside contemporary toxicology find the described progression, delayed onset following an apparently normal meal, then rapid and severe decline, broadly consistent with amatoxin poisoning, lending retrospective credibility to a story ancient historians themselves treated largely as certain. But this explanation does not fully capture how deliberately calculated the timing had to be. The delayed, gradual symptoms of amatoxin poisoning, a normal feeling delay of 6 to 12 hours, followed by a rapid, severe collapse, made death cap extract a poisoner's ideal tool, precisely because it left room for a trusted hand to administer a second, finishing dose if the first began to fail, a detail several ancient accounts of the day specifically describe happening at Claudius's bedside, a physician summoned to help, reportedly delivering the final fatal touch under the pretense of treatment. Some historians of Roman politics argue that an assassination disguised as an accident served Agrippina twice over, removing an emperor while functioning, through court rumor, as a clear demonstration of her power to anyone paying attention. How many other quiet, natural deaths among Rome's ruling class across the empire's long history use the exact same method, never significant enough to draw the same historical attention Claudius received? Whoever prepared that dish that night had to know exactly how long the delay would last and exactly when a second dose might be needed. Real, practiced expertise in a poison ancient Rome's imperial court clearly understood far better, and used far more often than it ever admitted publicly. And 2,000 years after his death, with modern hospitals, transplant surgery, and full chemical understanding of amatoxins available, why does medicine still have no reliable antidote for a mushroom this common, meaning a death cap eaten by mistake today carries genuinely comparable risk to the one that ended an emperor's reign? From a single dish that changed the course of an empire, we travel to a small, decorative seed, still quietly killing people around the world today. Number 10. Rosary pea. You are a craftsperson in ancient India, or later across West Africa and the Americas, threading small, glossy seeds onto a cord, brilliant red with a single black cap, beautiful enough to be prized as jewelry, ritual beads, and even a unit of weight for measuring gold and precious stones. You have strung hundreds of these seeds over the years without incident, because the hard outer coat keeps whatever is inside safely sealed away. Today, one seed cracks slightly under the pressure of your needle. You do not notice. It goes onto the cord anyway, and it will still be dangerous decades from now to whoever eventually wears it, or worse, whoever eventually chews it, an unmarked hazard that could travel through a dozen owners and 1,000 miles before it ever finds the one mouth that breaks it open. The seed is the rosary pea, or jaquirity bean, from the plant Abrus precatorius, and for thousands of years across South Asia, sub-Saharan Africa, and the Americas it has been used exactly as that opening scene describes, strung into jewelry, prayer beads, and ceremonial ornaments, and historically even used as a standardized small unit of weight for gold, silver, and gemstones because of its remarkably consistent size. The seed's intact, hardened coat is tough enough that a whole, unbroken seed can often pass entirely through the human digestive system without releasing its contents, which is precisely why generations of jewelry makers and wearers handled the beads for years without harm. The danger sits entirely inside that shell. A single seed that is chewed, cracked, or otherwise broken open releases a brin, a ribosome-activating toxin structurally related to ricin, but understood by toxicologists to be meaningfully more potent by weight, capable of killing an adult from a dose smaller than a single grain of rice. There is no antidote, and treatment today is limited to aggressive supportive care, managing organ failure as it happens rather than neutralizing the toxin directly. Modern case reports, despite full contemporary medical knowledge of the danger, continue to describe hospitalizations and deaths, including children who have chewed on decorative jewelry, craft project beads, or ornamental seeds without any understanding of what was inside them, and travelers who bring home a strand of beads as a souvenir with no warning attached at all. Toxicologists and craft historians explain the rosary pea's long, largely incident-free history as jewelry through the simple mechanics of that hardened seed coat. As long as the shell remains intact, the toxin inside stays sealed away, meaning centuries of artisans stringing, wearing, and trading these beads could do so safely provided the seed was never broken. During preparation or use, a genuinely reliable natural safeguard rather than luck. Its use as a weight standard for gold traders across South Asia specifically depended on that same structural consistency, each seed reliably close enough in size and mass to serve as a dependable measure, a practical application entirely separate from, and unrelated to, the toxin hidden inside. Craft historians note that traditional preparation techniques in some regions specifically emphasized handling the beads gently and drilling stringing holes carefully to avoid cracking the shell, suggesting at least some communities understood, even without modern toxicology, that damage to the seed coat carried real risk, an inherited caution passed down through craft technique rather than written warning. But this explanation does not fully account for how many people, across thousands of years of handling these seeds by hand with simple tools, needles, and drills, must have cracked a shell by accident at some point without immediately connecting a resulting illness to the bead they had just been working with. Abrin poisoning symptoms, including severe vomiting, internal bleeding, and organ failure, can take hours to fully develop, a delay that would have made connecting cause and effect genuinely difficult without modern medical understanding, meaning an unknown number of ancient jewelry makers may have died from their own craft materials without anyone ever realizing why, their illness attributed to bad food, bad water, or simple misfortune, rather than the beads sitting finished on the table beside them. Some medical historians and toxicologists studying traditional craft practices propose that rosary pea poisoning may represent one of history's most persistently underrecognized occupational hazards, a danger built directly into an object worn against bare skin by millions of people across multiple continents and centuries, surviving into the present day specifically because the beads remain visually appealing and are still sold, often without adequate warning, as tourist jewelry and craft supplies in parts of the world where the plant grows, sometimes alongside other dried seeds and beans that carry no danger at all, making it functionally impossible for an untrained buyer to tell which strand is decorative and which is lethal. How many ancient jewelry makers were poisoned by their own broken beads, their deaths recorded, if at all, as ordinary sudden illness rather than traced to the craft in their hands? Why did a substance this dangerous continue to be worn directly against skin for thousands of years across cultures that had no way of definitively connecting cause and effect? And of every substance on this list, deliberate poisons, accidental epidemics, delicacies eaten despite the risk, is it not the strangest that the ones still turning up in modern emergency rooms today arrive there not through eating, ritual, or war, but simply strung on a string and worn as jewelry, exactly as it was thousands of years ago? 10 foods and substances spanning 6 continents and more than 2,000 years, 10 entirely different relationships with death. A puffer fish organ still banned today because no method has ever made it safe. A fruit that poisons the rain falling off its own leaves. A hunting poison that could kill the hunter as easily as the prey. A syrup, an empire's elite manufactured and drank on purpose for centuries. A seed a besieged leader chose for himself rather than face capture. A hedgerow berry sweet enough to fool a child. A fungus mistaken for witchcraft and demonic possession across a continent. A precisely measured cup that executed a philosopher by law. A mushroom dish that ended an emperor's reign and started another's. And a decorative bead, worn for thousands of years, still capable of killing anyone who happens to break it open. None of these ever had a safe version. Not with the right preparation, not with the right ritual, not with modern science standing by. Ancient people ate, drank, hunted with, and wore these things anyway, out of necessity, desperation, warfare, ritual, or simple bad luck, and the exact same chemistry that killed them then is still sitting in forests, hedgerows, fish markets, and jewelry boxes right now, waiting for the same mistake to happen again. If one of these 10 surprised you more than the others, say which one in the comments below and let us know where in the world you're watching this from. If you want more of history's strangest and most dangerous secrets uncovered like this, subscribe and like this video so the next one finds you.